Israel does not want to be the party that is deemed responsible for the detonation of this ceasefire agreement. Hamas understands that. And so what it's doing is it's really testing the bounds and boundaries of what it can undertake in terms of carrying out terror raids against the IDF. Beyond the yellow line, 200 Hamas terrorists are currently trapped inside tunnels. And it seems to be the case that these 200 Hamas terrorists will actually be released and deported to other countries. Israel will track them, and I believe actually across the fullness of time, Israel will likely eliminate these terrorists. It really is an unacceptable idea that it took 11 years for a soldier of Israel, a hero of Israel, to be left in the purgatory of Hamas tunnels and dungeons for so very long. Ron Dermer was the most loyal confidant and remains so of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He never sought his own notoriety over and above the notoriety of the man who he serves. Hi folks, and welcome to this episode of the MirYam Institute Situational Briefing with me, Benjamin Anthony. Now, before we get going, I just want to ask all of you, if you're enjoying this content, please be sure to subscribe to the show and to click the bell icon so that you get regular notifications. You really will be helping us to reach an ever wider audience, and I thank you in advance of your partnership in that regard. And doing so also makes sure that you will be the first to see our incredible footage and our cutting-edge analysis. So whether you're watching us on the YouTube channel or you're downloading our podcasts on audio, please be sure to subscribe today. And I also want to remind you that I'm very interested in hearing your questions and learning about your comments. So please be sure to leave those in the comment section below, and we'll do everything that we can to get to those during the course of the show. For this episode, I'm going to be talking about Hamas terrorists operating inside the Gaza Strip, beyond the yellow line. I'm going to talk about my personal connection with Hadar Goldin, who was recently buried, having been returned to Israel after 11 years of his remains being held in captivity inside the Gaza Strip. And I'll also be reflecting on the legacy of Minister Ron Dermer, who's just announced his resignation from service for the time being, somebody with whom I met quite recently. So with all of that, I hope you enjoy this program, and it's on with the show. The first topic that I'd like to talk about today is the ongoing effort by Hamas and Hamas terrorists to undertake terror operations beyond the yellow line. Now, you'll remember that the yellow line is the area toward which, the perimeter toward which the Israel Defense Forces has withdrawn in order to bring about, and in accordance with the terms of the ceasefire agreement that was brokered by the Americans. And it's very apparent, very, very clear that Hamas is determined to really test the durability of this ceasefire agreement. And it's doing that because it understands that Israel is somewhat beholden to the Trump administration for the fact that the Trump administration brought back successfully the last 20 living hostages. And it's also in the midst of bringing back the remaining deceased hostages. 4 hostages remain in captivity, deceased hostages inside the Gaza Strip. Now, Israel does not want to be the party that is deemed responsible for the detonation of this ceasefire agreement. Hamas understands that. And so what it's doing is it's really testing the bounds and boundaries of what it can undertake in terms of reconstituting itself, in terms of carrying out terror raids against the IDF, guerrilla terror raids against the Israel Defense Forces. And that's why we're seeing these ongoing attempts beyond the yellow line in the area that Hamas is not permitted to be in any situation whatsoever. And those raids have in the past, it's important that people recognize, resulted in the death and the killing of soldiers of the IDF, including after the ceasefire agreement was reached. So we're going to continue to see Hamas making these attempts at really breaching the ceasefire agreement and seeking to cause Israel to have to respond in a way in which Hamas can claim that the full culpability for the dismantling and falling apart of the agreement rests squarely with the state of Israel. And we're seeing also an aspect of just how important these tunnels are to Hamas's survivability by way of the fact that 200 Hamas terrorists are currently trapped inside tunnels that are under the area controlled by the Israel Defense Forces. So again, beyond the yellow line. And it seems to be the case that Jared Kushner, who flew into Israel recently and met with Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday, has brokered an agreement with Israel whereby these 200 Hamas terrorists will actually be released and deported to other countries. In other words, allowed to leave the battlefield alive. Then they will be deported. But the challenge to that agreement is actually that there seem to be no countries whatsoever who are interested in accepting these terrorists. It remains to be seen whether or not that will change. I believe that it likely will change. You've got the usual suspects. You've got the Qataris. You've got Turkey. You've got others. I think eventually there will be a home found for these terrorists. But people should keep in mind that in the event that they are deported, Israel will track them. And I believe actually across the fullness of time, Israel will likely eliminate these terrorists. Another point that needs to be made very, very clearly is that the fact that these terrorists are able to be holed up and sheltered inside these tunnels proves beyond any reasonable doubt that every single civilian casualty that took place inside the Gaza Strip during the course of this war is the exclusive responsibility of Hamas, because this tunnel network that now shelters these terrorists could have been the very same network that Gazan civilians could have taken shelter in during the course of the conflict. And instead of them being able to do so in a manner that we saw, for example, the population of London being able to do in the London Underground during the course of the Blitz, when the Luftwaffe would launch its air raids over the skies of London, citizens of London would retreat into the London Underground system and they would be sheltered and safe for the duration of that bombing. We've seen the very opposite happen inside Gaza. We've seen a situation where Hamas terrorists are allowed exclusively to take shelter inside the terror tunnels that they excavated, and Gazan civilians have been forced and required to remain above ground throughout the duration of this war. And so I say again, every single civilian casualty that has taken place inside the Gaza Strip since October the 7th, 2023, is a consequence of Hamas depravity, of the genocidal jihadist attitude that Hamas operatives and the Hamas movement operates by way of, and every living civilian inside the Gaza Strip since October 7th, 2023, is the direct result of the humanity of the Israel Defense Forces, the Israeli government, and of our precision and the morals that we apply even to the theater of war. The next topic that I'd like to talk about is the notification that the tunnel in which Hadar Goldin's body was being held has been destroyed, and talk a little bit about my own personal association with the family. So in terms of the significance that people should attach to the destruction of this tunnel, I can only say as one individual, I don't attach a great deal of significance to that whatsoever. I don't attach a great deal of symbolism to that whatsoever. I think that the fact that these tunnels have existed for so very long is really a black mark on the entire defense establishment within the state of Israel. We should never have come to a point where it was understood and tolerated that Hamas was excavating tunnels beneath its soil with the sole goal of launching a terror attack against the people of Israel. So I really feel that it is a sad indictment upon our own view and short-sightedness with regard to the Gaza Strip that the tunnels still exist there and frankly were even permitted to exist in the first place. Now, with regard to my own association with the Goldin family, very early on, after Hadar Goldin of blessed memory was killed and kidnapped and his body taken into the tunnels of the Gaza Strip during the events of Operation Protective Edge in 2014, Israel's defensive operation inside Gaza, I began to work with the family in order to assist them with creating a public awareness campaign to prevent the plight of Hadar Goldin from dropping off the public consciousness, particularly overseas. And there's actually a video that you can see on the MirYam Institute YouTube channel of Hadar's twin brother saw Goldin speaking at an international conference in Washington, D.C., reciting a speech that I wrote for him at his behest in order to generate publicity around this terrible circumstance. And what I want people to know and to recognize about the Goldin family is that right from the beginning, Saw Goldin, who was the sibling with whom I dealt with, and both of his parents, Leah Goldin and Simcha Goldin, both of whom incidentally are academics in Israel, very educated, very Zionistic, fall into the national Zionist or religious Zionist camp, if I was to try and pigeonhole them. All three of them were very, very clear about their mindset. Their mindset was that in order for the Gaza Strip to be rebuilt after that war in 2014, the body of Hadar Goldin would have to first be returned to his family. And beyond that, they were very clear-minded that Israel needed to wield a policy against Hamas inside the Gaza Strip that clearly expressed and conveyed to them that the stealing of our people, the abduction of our innocents, the kidnapping of our soldiers will never be in the national interests of the Gazans. It will never be an asset within the Gaza Strip. It will only be a liability because Israel will extract a massive price for the abduction of its citizens or its citizen soldiers. They never, ever deviated, the Goldin family, from that position. And I think that it is really, again, deeply lamentable that the Goldin family's plight was largely ignored within Israel. Not that Israelis weren't sympathetic to them. They were. The vast preponderance of Israelis were deeply sympathetic to what the Goldin family was facing. But they weren't active. The Israeli public wasn't mobilized. The streets didn't convulse with the demand that Hadar's body must be brought home for burial, which ultimately it was, and it was buried just yesterday, thankfully. Instead, it tragically took the kidnapping of 252 hostages on October 7th, 2023, the murder of 1,200 innocent Israelis and non-Israelis inside the states of Israel on October 7th, 2023, and only with that horrific critical mass of people bound by this common tragedy, either the kidnapping of their loved ones or the murdering of their loved ones, did the name Hadar Goldin and the demand for his return to Israel return to the forefront of public consciousness. It should never have taken the tragedy of October 7th for Israel to move very, very deliberately to bring Hadar's body home. It's very sad that it has taken 11 years for him to be repatriated, for him to be gathered in within the borders of Zion and of Israel, the country for which he fought so very valiantly. And I do hope that that attitude and that ethos of the Goldin family, namely to ensure that our enemies understand very clearly that the kidnapping of our people will always be a liability and never an asset to their national goals. I do hope that that ethos has permeated the decision makers in Israel and is never removed from the attitudes and the philosophies of the Israeli government of today or future governments. It really is an unacceptable idea that it took 11 years for a soldier of Israel, a hero of Israel, to be left in the purgatory of Hamas tunnels and dungeons for so very long. I now, for the final topic for today, want to talk a little bit about the official resignation of Minister for Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer, formerly the ambassador of the States of Israel to the United States of America. And I don't know whether you all know this, but I always try to, for the purpose of these podcasts and for these briefings, to marry up my own personal experience and my own interactions and my own adventures, such as they may or may not be, with the broader context of headlines coming out of the State of Israel or the Jewish world. So I actually have met with Ron Dermer. I can't say that we're friends, but I met with him. I met with him for an extended period of time in January 2023. And while I'm not going to go into the context of what that meeting was about, he spoke for close to 3 hours about his philosophy and his attitude and where he sees his role with regard to the state of Israel and its long and enduring security and prosperity. Now, he actually started to work with Bibi Netanyahu, not when he was prime minister, but most notably when he was finance minister. Bibi Netanyahu, as finance minister, was engaged in the unlocking and the liberating and the liberation, one could say, of Israel's economy, which was a very different type of economy prior to Bibi taking the helm. And he seconded Ron Dermer as the economic attaché to Washington, D.C., I believe in 2005. And to take up that post, Ron Dermer had to surrender his American citizenship. That's something that is required by U.S. law, that if you're an ambassador with dual citizenship, one of which is American, and you're representing a second country, you have to surrender your American citizenship. And in a letter that Dermer wrote that really tells you about who this man is, that was recalled in this brilliant book, which I recommend to all of you. It's called And None Shall Make Them Afraid. And None Shall Make Them Afraid. It's authored by Rick Richmond. And in his letter surrendering his citizenship, Dermer wrote the following, and I'm quoting, "I left America because I wanted to help another nation I love defend the freedoms that Americans have long taken for granted. In serving the state of Israel and in working to secure our common future, I will champion those ideals all of my life. May God forever bless America." So what that statement to me shows is that Dermer was always committed to seeing the state of Israel rise to the highest heights that it possibly could, to be the very best that it could possibly be. He always had an aspirational attitude towards what Israel could achieve. And that's fundamentally, in my opinion, an American attitude, much more than it is, dare I say, a typical Jewish attitude. An American attitude probably informed by an upbringing in America that was extremely positive, and Dermer has said was entirely devoid of any anti-Semitism whatsoever. So this was a man who didn't operate from a minority mentality. Beyond all of that, in 2013, Dermer became Israel's ambassador to the United States of America. Benjamin Netanyahu was then prime minister of the state of Israel. And that brings me to the last point I'd like to make about his service before I take a moment to talk about his legacy. In 2015, Barack Obama, then President of the United States, had signed and ratified and was about to complete and conclude what was commonly known as the Iran deal, or the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that was seen correctly as a totally inadequate deal for policing Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions. And in 2015, Prime Minister Netanyahu was invited to speak to a joint session of the United States Congress by then Speaker of the House, John Boehner, who was a Republican. And there was a lot of hesitation in Israel, and I know this through my conversations with Ron Dermer, but I also know it from reading the reporting at the time. There was a lot of hesitation, including by Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, as to whether or not he should go and speak in opposition of a flagship foreign policy position of then President of the United States, Barack Obama, namely the JCPOA, which Israel felt endangered our very existence. And as he hesitated, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Ron Dermer said to him, at a time like this, with a danger and a threat such as this, and I'm paraphrasing here, why are you Prime Minister of the State of Israel if not to go and speak, if not to go and press the case of the State of Israel on behalf of the people of Israel? Ron Dermer then wrote the speech that Prime Minister Netanyahu conveyed to the joint session of Congress. And I remember watching that speech. I was in a hotel room in the United States at the time, and I watched Prime Minister Netanyahu enter the chamber, that storied, famous chamber, walking his way through the aisle to the handshakes of the politicians surrounding him, and walking to the dais at the front of the room, and thinking to myself, this man, Prime Minister Netanyahu, is going to have to really make the speech of his lifetime. And he promptly proceeded to do precisely that. That speech was written by Ron Dermer. And when I sat with Dermer in January 2023, he conveyed to me that while I was very appreciative of that speech and of the conviction that informed that speech, that he, Dermer, said, if a speech results only in a great speech having been given, I view that speech as completely unimportant and as my work not yet completed. If that speech can be viewed as one link in the chain to dismantling Iran's nuclear weapons program, then I view it as a worthy endeavor. In other words, this was a brilliant speech writer, completely unimpressed by a speech in and of itself, unwed to action, unwed to policy, unwed to the actual tackling of the issue that the speech was focused upon. So in terms of this man's legacy, I think that everybody should be aware that some of the keynote speeches by Prime Minister Netanyahu were crafted by this man, by Ron Dermer, including the speeches we've all seen Prime Minister Netanyahu give at the United Nations General Assembly over the years, including the repeated addresses that the Prime Minister has given to joint sessions of the United States Congress. Ron Dermer was the most loyal confidant and remains so of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but not at all in a submissive way, as I've just shown, more than willing to speak truth to power. He never courted the press. He never sought his own notoriety over and above the notoriety of the man who he serves, namely the Prime Minister of the State of Israel. But I think that in addition to his hand in the brokering of the Abraham Accords, in the strengthening and preserving of the Israel-US relationship, which he's done in a very unique fashion, particularly since October the 7th, in a way that I think very few people would have been able to do. And in addition to all of his speech writing and his brave and determined representation of the people of Israel during his ambassadorship to the United States of America, there is, on the other side of that, the consideration that Ron Dermer was Minister of Strategic Affairs on October 7th, 2023, and was certainly part of the conception and the mindset that drastically, dangerously, tragically underestimated the threat that was coming from the Gaza Strip on that fateful day. And I also will say that Dermer was mentioned by Prime Minister Netanyahu as a potential successor as leader of the Likud and even Prime Minister of the State of Israel. And I actually don't think that that's a very realistic prospect at all. And the reason is that Ron Dermer, never served in the Israel Defense Forces. I think that the preponderance of Israelis expect military service among males. It's just a prerequisite, if you like, for acceptance by the broad swath of Israeli voters. He never served in the Israel Defense Forces. He moved to Israel when he was beyond the age for service. And in addition to that, he rarely speaks publicly in Ivrit, but when he does sound like a quintessential American muddling through his knowledge of the Hebrew language. And I don't think that that leads to him being accepted as an Israeli by the Israeli voters. He's not like Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's totally fluent in English, totally fluent in Ivrit. Minister Ron Dermer, obviously a great communicator in English, far less compelling in Ivrit, I would say. But another couple of final points about this man. I've worked with chiefs of the general staff of the Israel Defense Forces as the chief commanders of the Israeli military. I've worked with ambassadors. I've worked with elected officials in Israel. Every single one of them, even those who are fierce critics of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and there are many in those ranks, every single one of them is very positively predisposed to the intellect and the sincerity of Ron Dermer. They never question how bright he is. They never question how sincere he is. And I actually believe that he's the embodiment of a man walking around with a servant's heart. And that's why I'm pleased that while he has resigned as Minister of Strategic Affairs, he's going to stay on in some sort of capacity as special envoy, something akin to what we've seen lately with Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of President Donald Trump. I think that's to the benefit of all of us. And I think that Ron Dermer's place in history, though mixed, is firmly secured. And what I've just mentioned are just a few of his achievements and just a few of the challenges that anyone who wades into the cauldron of service encounters during the course of their career. Very few will reach the heights of Ron Dermer. And the same author of the book, And None Shall Make Them Afraid, Rick Richman, actually says that Dermer's service as a diplomat is no less significant than the service of Israel's first ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Abba Eban, a brilliant orator in his own right. So I wish Ron Dermer every possible success and hope that he and his family go from strength to strength.